Welcome to Voices of the Community, which explores critical issues facing Northern California communities. We introduce you to the voices of community thought leaders and change makers who are working on solutions that face our fellow individual community members, neighborhoods, cities, and our region. This is George Koster, your host. This episode is part of our series exploring COVID-19's impact on nonprofits and small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area. Back in April of 2020, when we decided to create this ongoing series on COVID-19's impact, first on nonprofits and then on small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area, we, like you, had no idea how long the pandemic would go on and what the health and economic impact would be on our community. Going into 2021, the pandemic is now killing more people, shutting down more nonprofits and small businesses, along with wiping out the livelihoods of families, neighborhoods, and communities. We will continue to shine a spotlight on the nonprofits and small businesses that make up the fabric of our community, along with the founders and staff who are struggling to deal with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their operations, services, and sustainability until we can all get to the other side of the pandemic. Along the way, we will also share with you all the amazing solutions that our nonprofits, small businesses, foundations, and government leaders are working on to help us all get to the other side of the pandemic and come together to rebuild our communities with more economic, social, and environmental equality. In today's show, we wanted to focus on the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic and economic meltdown have and are continuing to have on our local governments. We asked our friend of the show, Judi Brown, and her team at CivicMakers to help us put together and co-host a panel discussion with local government thought leaders to share with us how they are responding to the economic and health crisis, along with their experiences, insights, and recommendations.
So my name is Judi Brown. I am the co-founder and chief impact officer of CivicMakers. So for the past 6 years, we have been working to bring innovation methodologies into mostly local governments around the Northern California mega region, working with some departments at the state of California as well, and have really had the privilege to be on the ground with our partners, with our clients in true sort of co-creation and collaboration. So the folks who are joining us today, Rebecca is a longtime partner and Kelli is a more recent partner in this work. So we have Rebecca Woodbury, who is the former director of digital service and open government with the City of San Rafael, and has just recently launched her own venture, which I'll let her talk about in just a moment. And of course, Assistant Director of Human Resources, Kelli Parmley in the City of San Jose. And we are here to talk about how we are bringing innovation and learning into local government in the age of COVID. I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Judi. My name's Rebecca Woodbury, and I worked for the City of San Rafael for the last 12 years. I actually started as an intern back in 2009, and for the last couple of years, I became the Director of Digital Service and Open Government, a new department that was a reorganization of the traditional IT department, but also taking on digital services and community engagement and transparency work as well. So I served as the city's public information officer and built this new department of digital service and open government.
And Kelli?
Hi, Kelli Parmley. I'm the Assistant Director for Human Resources at the City of San Jose. For those who don't know, it's the 10th largest city in the United States. I'm originally from the East Coast, and prior to coming to the city about 4 years ago, I spent most of my time in public higher education, but also a stint in state government in New York State. I am on point for supporting the HR department overall, but have been in the Emergency Operations Center with the city since early March of this, almost a year ago.
And that, Kelli, is a great segue into what we want to talk about a little bit here, which is COVID-19's impact. So as I mentioned, our small firm, CivicMakers, has been doing work regionally, and we have seen a lot of impact that's been happening with our clients. For example, having projects where our project managers were being deployed to emergency operations centers, especially when The work is around upskilling and professional development. We'll talk a little bit about that later because both Rebecca and Kelli have been doing some of this work with us. But essentially that moment, after March 17th, that was kind of now what, right? Everyone is sort of deployed. And then how are we going to come back together? Another challenge that we've been seeing here in San Francisco with my clients here is that we have some grant-funded projects for grants that had intended outcomes that were written pre-COVID and research plans that were written pre-COVID that we've had to completely reimagine with the constraints of shelter in place, for example. So some observational research and kind of like field work that is supposed to be part of those grants and just research projects in general. So really from a strategic perspective, figuring out, for example, how do we connect people experiencing homelessness who are also looking for jobs at a time when a lot of those services have essentially closed their doors. So that's kind of what we're seeing from our perspective. So we'll start with Rebecca first. Rebecca, how has COVID-19 impacted the operations of San Rafael's program? What have you or your team done to respond, and how has it impacted the local economy or small businesses and nonprofits?
Sure. So first of all, I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation today. San Rafael is a population of 60,000. And then you're also going to hear from San Jose, the 10th largest city in the country. So it'll be interesting to see some of the challenges and opportunities that we share and how they're different at these different scales. So as I was thinking about what 2020 felt like and there was all sorts of phases to it and waves of challenges. And it took me back a year ago to when this first stay-at-home order went into place. And really, we pretty immediately had to throw our workforce into a large-scale work-from-home setup. And so we had to go back to the basics in terms of thinking about how to equip our employees with working from home. So those early days of that stay-at-home order, we're scrambling together to put work from home policies together. The equipment challenge, things were back ordered like webcams and laptops and things like that. Cybersecurity measures, we weren't very well equipped for everyone working from home all of a sudden. And then also just the training and support that people need for how to work from home, what tools they're going to use, and how they're going to get their work done in a now distributed team. And so that was kind of the early days, was really that scramble to put all of those things in place. And I'll admit, sometimes it meant people taking their desktops home with them. We really didn't have all the equipment that we needed so that people could work from home all of a sudden. And then once people's basic technology needs were met to the best of our ability, we started realizing that we had some operational challenges with forms. So that was a major kind of day-to-day operational need. And that was, again, really internal, right? Not even looking external yet, but how do we as an organization continue to exist day to day without our printers and our manila envelopes and interoffice mail and all the way things get routed typically. So we realized we needed to take care of these kind of day-to-day internal administrative forms that were typically printed and filled out by hand. And this was a pretty big undertaking for us. So around the same time, the U.S. digital response was just getting established. And that is a group of volunteer technologists that came together during the pandemic, and they're still in existence and doing incredible work today. And they were getting off the ground, and I reached out to them and I said, help, we have a bunch of forms that need to be digitized. And so they provided us with a volunteer product manager, engineer, and content strategist who helped us inventory all of our forms and prototype them in the workflows so that we could just use off-the-shelf technology that we already had to get these forms digitized. So that was a huge undertaking. And then departments started to look at how to digitize their service offerings to the public. So we had departments creating virtual public counters so that people could talk to planners and permit techs just like they would be going to City Hall to do. We moved all of the permits online. Previously, some of them were online, but not all of them. We moved all of them online. We created virtual library and recreation programming. So really just looking at all of our services and saying, how can we do them digitally and virtually? But I think the biggest change, and Kelli, you mentioned this, was how much of our workforce transitioned into becoming disaster service workers. And typically, disasters, emergencies happen over the course of a couple days. And so you might be a disaster service worker for a couple of days, but then you go back to your job. This went on and on and on. And so essentially, with this very long activation of an emergency operations center, many people just had entirely new jobs overnight so that they can support, the continuous and urgent need for public information, supporting the health department and community groups on a variety of different things like testing sites, a lot more Spanish language translation, food distribution, mask donations, all sort of things that we're spinning up and doing more of. And we needed people to be able to do those things. One of the things we did in downtown to support our restaurants was we turned the main street into an area for outdoor dining and outdoor retail, and all the street closures and all the things that went into that to make it safe, and having, more parklets and things like that. And so really people's jobs changed in a very big way, not in a temporary way, but in a pretty long-term way at this point. My team was stretched pretty thin because we had our hand in a lot of different places. We became the PIO team for the city, and there were waves of this, but it's been pretty intense the whole time in terms of public information, because it's not just the email newsletters going out or maintaining the website. We were making a lot of signs actually to go out into the community, and we were really activating public space with a lot of community information. So that was a huge, huge lift that continues to be. We also started a project pretty early on in the pandemic to build a free Wi-Fi network in our most densely populated and disadvantaged neighborhoods. And we partnered with other government agencies, the school system, nonprofits, and a bunch of volunteers as well, who put in hundreds of hours. We funded it entirely from donations as well as the county. And we were able to, in a matter of months, get a free Wi-Fi network set up that is mostly being used right now by kids to do their schoolwork. And so that was a huge undertaking that our team took on as well.
All right, Kelli, same question. How has COVID-19 impacted the operations of City of San Jose's programs? What have you and your team done to respond? How has it impacted your local economy, your small businesses, and nonprofits?
Yeah, so part of me wants to say exactly what Rebecca said, right? I mean, I think if you're in local government, those threads of the types of programs that we're talking about and the entire pivot of your workforce, not only just in terms of the people part of it, but the how you do your work is all relevant. And in the case of San Jose, a lot of it's a matter of scale. So I'll try to focus in on a couple of things, pivot a couple of things, but everything that Rebecca said, we did just at a larger scale. I think it's important in the city of San Jose to know a few things that I did not know coming from the East Coast. So 180 square miles, over 1 million people, about 40% of our population is foreign born, and almost 60% speak a language other than English at home. So why do I say all of that? In order to serve with your community on a regular day, that poses a lot of challenges. When you think about roads, how many miles of them, sewer lines, we have a regional wastewater facility that's not just responsibility for us, but an entire region. It's the largest thing on the West Coast. That response calls have to cover 180 square miles, that your community centers are dispersed amongst very different neighborhoods, urban, suburban, just out there kind of stuff. And when you add on top of that a pandemic, in which I really want to emphasize, it wasn't just COVID, right? We hit then a financial crisis. Then we've known for a long time about issues of racial equity. And yet in terms of an emergency operations center, we're confronted right face to face with those issues in our community, right directly at our city hall and on the streets. And on top of that, we had PG&E blackouts. We had early fire season. We had to deal with making sure that we were safe and secure for the election. So my reason for saying all of that is that the special circumstances then required a bunch of pivots, I would sort of call them, from a large city perspective. So one was pivoting our workforce Pivoting our emergency operations center, they're set up for a very specific structure. I couldn't even tell you all the details, but there's a blue shift and a gold shift, and they're very specific roles. And we've trained on how to do those roles, and had to blow that up and rethink about what our EOC structure looked like, which was like setting up another small city. And then thirdly, we had to pivot our programs, in part because we were asked in particular by the county to do some things that we had not done before. So in addition to all the things that Rebecca talked about, we actually then needed to stand up food and necessities for the entire county, not just our own folks. And that was one of the biggest things that we did in the pandemic. So our programs got pivoted in multiple ways. So I'll say in terms of the workforce, every other Monday, we onboard all of our city employees now in a virtual environment. When they take the oath of office, I'm really, really energetic and particular about that as a rite of passage, because when you sign up to work at the city or any local government, you're signing up to be a disaster service worker, and nobody knows what that means until a disaster hits, right? So making sure folks understand that that's both an opportunity and a curse at times in terms of disaster service work. Then 40% of your workforce, 40% of 5,600 full-time people overnight went to work remote. Some of them took their own personal devices and figured it out. We didn't have VPN access for many folks. There was a flurry of forms to do that. How do I communicate with my team? What's this thing called Zoom? I mean, when you think back about it, it's unbelievable to me that a place that has an inertia at times that is just frustrating to everybody suddenly had to rethink itself like overnight. So you got regular business as usual stuff that you need to do. And about 40% of our programs and services, those things that we don't care to talk about, like, does your sewer work? Do you have clean water? Did your garbage get picked up? And did your recycling work? All those things kept going. People didn't miss a beat with that stuff. And then the others came online after it. So there's the business as usual. And then we stood up an emergency operations center and disaster service work that was basically a leadership side and a boots on the ground side, right? So it was assistance for homeless folks, food necessities, a series of other things. And my team got to make the phone call to folks who were on administrative leave to say, hey, guess what? You're a disaster service worker, and we need you to go spend some time now for the next umpteen weeks working in a homeless shelter for folks to make sure they have what they need and are able to be quarantined. So it's that kind of pivot that was just so huge. We stood up at its peak. It was around 650 employees in our emergency operations center. That's the equivalent of taking our public works department with no additional staff and also about 650 to 670 vacancies in the city, standing that thing up and working it for months and months and months. So that whole pivot of the EOC structure, and then how do we conduct our business as usual in this entirely foreign territory for us? So I think then that's the workforce pivot and the EOC pivot. And then I would say, in terms of programs, the unique thing I think I'll just say for us, in addition to everything that Rebecca just mentioned, including digital inclusion work, food and necessities, and necessities included things like we were trying to figure out how to get people diapers and wipes, in addition to making sure that schools could distribute food, that the food bank could actually box food fast enough and get it out to people, right? It was all those other necessities. So the unique thing for us was in June, when we realized we probably were getting ready to roll out some new service. We had to figure out how to restart the city, which was harder than shutting it down. And we needed to pay real close attention to our workforce under new circumstances. So we fired up a branch in the EOC called Power by People 2.0, which was an extension of a city manager's priority previously called Power by People that had 4 large teams under it, which I led. Number 1 was just a safe workplace, which included the marriage of facilities with our safety folks. And so there's a huge number of folks focused on codes of safe practice. Can you, should we, do we bring people back into city facilities or not, and when, under what circumstances? A second group, employee health and well-being, super important. And it's going to launch a trauma-informed care program that we're going to start here in April. Again, can't speak enough about the mental health and well-being of our workforce that goes beyond the public safety folks into our entire population. Drive to Digital was our initiative around how do we not use paper anymore? A lot more complicated than that, but certainly a huge effort on our IT team in partnership with us. And then lastly, effective teams. First thing to go in a team environment is trust. So you can imagine when you go virtual, it's a double whammy. And so we had to figure out how do we help folks manage a team, not just technically using Zoom, but how do we do it? So that's been in operation since June, and is probably what I would call our signature unique thing from a workforce development, workforce support, in addition to everything else we're doing in HR kind of function. So I guess that's what I would say about kind of 3 big pivots.
So, Rebecca and Kelli, out of your pivots and all of the work you've done, what do you feel has been the biggest impact of a program? For example, Rebecca, your whole idea of free Wi-Fi, for example.
Sure. So I think that one of the most lasting and impactful elements of a lot of this work was the new partnerships and collaborations that were spurred. The Wi-Fi project really stemmed from someone in the community emailing me and saying, I heard there's a lot of kids that don't have the internet right now. And I have some experience with Wi-Fi networks. I think we could probably design and build one pretty cheap. That's where it started. And he then put in countless hours of work. We had another volunteer with a local IT company step up who had also built mesh Wi-Fi networks before. And so we had now hundreds of volunteer hours going into something. County supervisor stepped up and led the philanthropic efforts to get all the money donated for the project. And it was a real all hands on deck. I had never worked that closely with the schools before. I had never worked that closely with the county IT department before, and also some boots on the ground nonprofits in the community. What's great about a project like that and the intensity and the immediacy of the need, right? It really pushed us into action to do things quickly. The relationship that were formed are going to have long-lasting impacts beyond this Wi-Fi project. So out of this, we also learned as we got out there that a lot of these families didn't have computers in their homes, didn't have access to laptops. So the devices were an issue. A lot of folks, their only access to the internet was through their smartphone and on their data plan. So we learned a lot, and this has spurred other efforts. We then partnered with the same partners on the Wi-Fi project and created a donation fund that we are now using the funds generated to just buy laptops for families so that they can own them. I think that there's going to be a lot more partnerships and collaborations from these efforts that are going to have these long-lasting impacts. Relatedly, there was a project that actually predated the pandemic in some ways, but it hadn't got off the ground yet completely, that the county was spurring. I think because of the pandemic, the spotlight on the digital divide was so bright, you couldn't look away from it anymore. I'd been talking with the county pre-pandemic about this project to create sort of a countywide roadmap for bridging the digital divide. And because the pandemic really highlighted the need and it was so compelling, and again, you couldn't look away from it, I think that that project now has a lot more of a compelling need behind it than people really knew. Marin is a pretty affluent area, so it's easy to look away from the need that's out there sometimes. And so I think a silver lining was that spotlight on the need. And I think that this Digital Marin, which is, again, it's a long-term planning effort, I think has a lot more attention and a lot more people wanting to be a part of the solution. And I think there's also these relationships, these collaborations. What they really show is that government can't do these things alone. It's really a cross-sector approach that I think is coming out of this, that in order to solve these really big problems, we need businesses, government, nonprofits, philanthropy, education, healthcare. We need all the sectors coming together and collaborating on this. And so my hope is that that's really the long-range benefits that come out of some of these projects, is really these partnerships and this understanding that these collaborative cross-sector partnerships are really going to be the way forward to solving these problems in the future.
I'm going to turn to you, Kelli, and ask if you could pick one of the programs that you worked on and how that program had an impact on the community and how you carry that forward.
I do want to acknowledge that what Rebecca said, we certainly did on a large scale. We had already started a lot of work in the digital inclusion space and had a lot of activity going on with our East Side, it only ramped up our game. So for example, the library became the distribution hub for hotspots, for laptops, and a few other things because the kids were not able to get their schooling because they didn't have access to Wi-Fi because we hadn't fully rolled out the program. So I would say it wasn't new to us. It just accelerated our work. But given that HR is an internal facing department and what I would call one of our strategic support units with IT and finance, I think what I would say is, and this will give certainly a big nod to CivicMakers, HR and IT are an unusual sort of marriage. We'll at least say that we've been dating for a while and might be to the engagement stage by the time we get to pandemic, in large part because we really enjoy the director for IT and the assistant director who came from Minnesota. But the assistant director, Jerry Dreesen, and myself have really believed in a partnership between IT and HR, in part because people, process, and technology, like that magic, soup or recipe only comes alive when a couple of people are committed to it. And so what I would say about the pandemic was, number one, it forced them into business process automation like nobody's business. We had just gotten an agreement with SimplyGov to be our business process automation. We had a relatively new person join the IT department who was a PeopleSoft guru. So we really started to push the envelope on PeopleSoft. And so they launched by creating a roadmap, a set of OKRs. We all were working in agile processes and methodologies. So we were in 2-week sprints. So while they were developing the business process automation teams, many of them we were the customer for in terms of it was our operational work. It became very clear that employees didn't have a single source of truth. They didn't know where to go get things. So what happened was, I came in and said, we really need to figure out how to build the capacity and capabilities of our people. And Rebecca, who I feel like is a kindred spirit, that we don't have to sort of have things come from on high, that if we give the skills and the capabilities and empower our employees, boy, you can come up with some really smart solutions to problems that you'll never find, in the executive suite of any organization. And so we had already been working with CivicMakers back in the spring. We're ready to go on this really cool learning lab to deal with companies who were in startup mode for some solutions for our city. We had to shut that down. And so, I was going to figure out a way to work with CivicMakers. So we launched for the first time in the fall, which is something San Rafael is accustomed to, is we did a learning lab where we taught 15 people how to do human-centered design, how to use the tools and methodologies and mindsets to empower employees to figure out what it is that they need. And so we framed this project around how we would rethink an intranet, how we would develop a modern intranet. And people came up with skits about how to onboard people using Barbie dolls. I mean, it was fantastic. And so what's the point of all of that? When you can free 15 people by working smartly with a partner like CivicMakers and an HR and an IT group who already are aligned in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, it really builds a culture that we need to have, which is empower the people to find solutions and let them run with it. So we're about ready to launch the second learning lab on Friday. We'll launch another one after that. I think that the pandemic and what we're doing only enables and facilitates that work. So it's not a community-facing thing. However, Harvard came in and did a side-by-side project with us over the last 3 months to talk about what our external digital strategy was going to be. And they were super helpful in saying, your external is not going to be successful unless it's married to what your capabilities, mindsets, and skill sets are of your internal folks. So if you want to deliver digital services, you got to have people who know how to do it and are also empowered to do it. So that's what I would say about impact. And I'm so excited for the next round of learning labs.
I would love to piggyback on that because everything you said makes my heart sing. We have been doing learning labs for several years now with CivicMakers. And I have to say, the fact that we had been doing that work made this emergency operations center a lot more naturally, because for the last couple of years, we've been doing this work. And so I think a lot of the great things that happened last year are the result of employees that have been engaged and empowered in these ways. And it was so beautiful to see the dividends of that work. I think sometimes when you're doing the work of culture change, it can feel slow and you can be questioning, is this making a difference? Are we moving the needle? And I will say that during 2020, I saw the dividends of that work. I saw the creativity, the empowerment, and the cross-departmental nature of the work, which I think was just so critical during this time. Government is so typically siloed, and you can't operate like that when you're a disaster service worker or when you're operating in an emergency operations role. So the fact that we've been doing that work up front, I think really paid off.
So I'm going to move us along to the next question, which are around lessons learned. So some of the solutions or lessons, I'm always thinking about bell curve representation that we have here with our small city and our 10th largest city in the country. And then we have this smaller city that was kind of working through what it might be like to do this cross-departmental problem solving a few years ago. And Kelli, I would say the honeymoon phase of HR and IT right now in San Jose is really beautiful. So to do a little bit of a deeper dive here around lessons learned. So some of the solutions or lessons you or your team developed or learned in addressing the pandemic, the economic meltdown, the social unrest, testing, vaccine, there's so many different things here. But if there were some best practices that you or your team have developed that could be used in future crises, or systems or processes that you wish you had in place, perhaps digital signatures would be one of those, to be more proactive as opposed to reactive. So I'll go ahead and bounce it to Kelli first for this one.
I could say like probably 1,000 things, but I think what I'll say, and this is going to sound so unsexy, but I think is something for the future, like this is super unsexy and so important, is cost recovery. We're going to be at cost recovery for the next 3-5 years. We're still doing some cost recovery from the flood. And I know it doesn't sound at all glamorous. And I think it speaks to how do we think about it sooner? And not just think about it, but have this stuff in place. How do we literally do a big after action review after this, which we've already got a study going for our emergency operations center, but how do we get going more effectively with that so it doesn't slow stuff down in the process, but also doesn't keep our workforce distracted for the next 3 to 5 years? I think we got going pretty quickly, but not quickly enough for some of what was happening. And I think we could say that we could do a better job at that. I think the second thing I would say, given the nature of San Jose, and the thing that I pray that we don't go backwards on or lose sight of, is we really upped our game really quickly with translation and interpretation services and some innovations in that space. When our community has the characteristics and demographics that I described at the beginning, we were doing enough to get by with, and we knew we had some work to do, but we were forced to. When you adopt the mindset that we got to do this with our community as opposed to our community, I think you begin to think and act differently. And there were different communities who were affected differently by testing and then vaccinations now, and by the COVID virus itself. And so how do you then take data, but then figure out how do we communicate with folks and mobilize them? For many folks who don't, and for good reasons, don't trust local government. I mean, we are not a panacea. And so then how do you work with your partners in the community-based organizations, not just from a contractual relationship, which we were used to, but from a good spirit, shared vision, working with the community, kind of authentic relationship, community engagement. The third thing I would say along those lines is community engagement. We stood up an entire branch called virtual community engagement because there's so much of our processes require community input, but also just in terms of good practice engagement with our community. And so how do we not lose what we learned? Because we stood that one up really quick. There was a fantastic team who went in, basically packaged stuff, taught stuff, helped other city staff understand how to do this effectively and really engage the community. And, we're using translation and interpretation services within Zoom in order to run our council meetings. Like, who would have thought of that a year ago? So I guess it's a combination of recovery. How do we do better at that going forward and learn some lessons? How do we make sure we don't lose our learning around community engagement? And for God's sakes, how do we actually continue to accelerate the work around translation and interpretation so we're effectively working with our community?
My big lessons learned, some of these things were things I was practicing before, but during the pandemic, they became really necessary. One, open source and share what you make. I can't say thank you enough to San Francisco's digital service content team for doing the incredible work they have done throughout the pandemic. And we were able to borrow all of that and use that great talent that they have there in terms of content and communications. So they made toolkits. The state was making toolkits. We also made toolkits for everything that we made. So any graphic, any sign, anything we made, put it out there to share, because it might be something that some small town in some other state can leverage and use and put their logo on. So when you do good work in government, please share it with others. We even made some versions of things and took our logo off so that it could be shared more easily. So I just implore you in government to open source and share everything that you make. Another kind of communications related question I have is, how might the design of policy be informed by the communications of it? As a communicator during this time, there were some incredibly frustrating moments when you were asked to make a sign to explain something, and it became very, very difficult to explain it when you read through what the policy really was. So making a sign for a park about what people could or couldn't do at that park became increasingly difficult as these complex orders were morphing and changing. And it felt at times we were making new signs for parks every week because things were changing. And we were trying to clarify, you can play basketball if it's only you, or you can play, there was just these very complicated rules that we were trying to explain on signs. And I don't know if signs with a lot of words on them, people walk past and don't read, so they aren't effective. So I want us to consider how the way that we communicate something might inform the way that that policy ends up being designed. And I think that that's something to really explore in a lot of different ways. And then lastly, I think really the importance of trust during really complicated times. There was a project that happened kind of early-ish on. I'm trying to remember the timing of it. The first stay-at-home order kind of closed almost everything. Then at some point, restaurants and retailers were going to be allowed to operate outdoors. And we weren't really equipped to handle that in a permitting sense at scale. So one of the things that we did pretty much in a matter of a couple of days was we created an automatic permit for outdoor dining and retail. And we had to trust people. We had to give them the rules and say, this is what you're agreeing to, and then trust businesses to follow them. And then essentially once they hit submit, the automatic email that they got in response said, this is your permit. And it was something that I thought was pretty amazing. And it shocked some of the business owners because it's not what they're used to. So they were shocked, but delighted. And they were able to get out there and start making money again quickly. So I thought it was really incredible, but there had to be trust for that to happen. I think that especially when we're talking about scaling critical services to people who really need them, I think that's the time where you just focus on reducing the barriers and trust that people need these things. So I think that the lessons learned for me is really share everything you make. How might we design policies so that it can be communicated in an effective way? And then how might we trust each other more so that more people get help quicker?
Thank you, Rebecca. That was awesome. So many good tidbits here. So in the spirit of community engagement, ask if there is a way that any of the listeners can engage in helping either City of San Jose or City of San Rafael, either through City Council, donating money to a nonprofit, or volunteering. So in our last tiny bit of time remaining, if either of you have anything to recommend in that sphere.
Well, for us, there's an umbrella campaign called Silicon Valley Strong, which is basically our community communications, but also receiver of donations. And it goes to all kinds of things in need in the community. And I think that's the most effective way to do it in the city of San Jose.
Thank you, Kelli. Thoughts, Rebecca?
Yeah, now with all this virtual civic engagement, it's easier than ever to participate, make your voice heard. So I would encourage people to sit on their couch and watch a council meeting, even if they don't speak, to just watch and get familiar with the process and how those funny things work. And then I would definitely encourage you to think about getting involved in some way. I know it's a big lift sometimes to think about running for office, like an elected position, but there are all sorts of opportunities to join advisory boards, commissions, task forces, and even start your own. So I think there's a lot of ways to get involved that we don't always think of. Sometimes we just think we have to run for office, but there's all sorts of other ways to be a part of these efforts. And it's through these different boards and commissions that you inform the city council. You know, you often make the recommendations to the city council that they often support because they're getting recommended by their advisory groups in that way. And so it's a great way to get involved. And I think it's now easier than ever because of virtual.
Thanks for that reminder, Rebecca. I forget that I tell all of our new employees every 2 weeks the beauty and the opportunity in local government. Having worked in state government, having worked in public higher education, having spent a lot of that time also engaging with our federal government, I absolutely had no idea when I was going through a public administration program as a very young person, how much impact local government can have and how immediate and transparent it is. And so I talk about the immediacy and the transparency to our new employees, in large part because I want to remind them that as public servants in local government, that any given day, a local resident or the newspaper could see what you're doing, and you want to make sure that you're paying attention to that. But more importantly, any Tuesday night in the city of San Jose, you can see government at work that has almost immediate impact. And if you want to go back several years and look at memos and videos and understand what happened historically, you can do that. You can't do that in state government. You can't do that with the federal government. And so our obligation in local government is to be transparent and to respond to the wishes of our council members and community. And so I think people do not realize that you can, on any given Tuesday, go watch, make public comment, and get engaged in many ways in local government. So yes, you can do more than volunteer.
That's great. So thank you, Rebecca and Kelly and Judi, for being on Voices of the Community today and sharing all of your really wonderful work, both in civic innovation, civic engagement, and we'll make sure that everyone has your contact information, website, social media, and they can follow your work and get engaged. And thanks again, Judi, for helping us put together the CivicMaker Voices of the Community panel discussion today.
Thank you, my longtime friend, George.
That's it for this episode of Voices of the Community. You've been listening to the voices of Judi Brown from CivicMakers, Kelli Parmley from the City of San Jose, and Rebecca Woodbury, who formerly worked at the City of San Rafael. For more information about CivicMakers, go to civicmakers.com. To get engaged with the City of San Jose, go to sanjoseca.gov. And to find out more about Rebecca's startup, the Department of Civic Things, go to deptofcivicthings.com. To find out more about civic innovation, please go to georgecoster.com and click on our archives to listen to our 2016 show titled What is Civic Innovation?, which features Judi Brown from CivicMakers, Krista Konolakis from the City of San Francisco's Office of Innovation, and Susan Stewart-Clark from Common Knowledge. Tune in to next week's show where we will be featuring the voices from B Magic and the 3rd Street Youth Center. We hope that you enjoyed the insights, points of view, and personal stories from the voices of changemakers and their nonprofits and small businesses featured in this series. To find out more and get engaged with the nonprofits, small businesses, and staff members featured in the series, please go to my website, georgecoster.com, and click on Voices of the Community to find links to the extended versions of these interviews and to listen to the entire series. After listening to these stories, we hope that you will consider making a donation and volunteering to provide a hand up to your fellow community members. I want to thank my associate producer, Eric Estrada, and Casey Nance at Citron Studios, along with the wonderful crew at the San Francisco Public Press and KSFP. Voices of the Community is a member of Intersection for the Arts, which allows us to offer you a tax deduction for your contributions. Please go to georgecoster.com and click on the donate link to make a donation to help us provide future shows just like this one. While you're on our website, you can enjoy our archived past shows, which feature community voices working on solutions to critical issues facing Northern California communities, And you can sign up for our newsletter to find out more about future shows, as well as shows and events from the organizations that are included in our episodes. Take us along on your next COVID walk by subscribing to Voices of the Community on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at George Coster, and we'd love to hear from you with feedback and show ideas, so send us an email to george@georgecoster.com. I'm George Coster in San Francisco, and thank you for listening.